Deputy Sarah Holloway was the first to notice that the mashed potatoes were still steaming when she entered the Whitmore farmhouse at 8:47 on that December evening, and that single detail would haunt her for the rest of her life, because the neighbor who called in the welfare check had been trying to reach the family for 6 days, meaning that whatever force had taken Martin and Linda, Whitmore and their 3 children had also stopped time itself inside that house, freezing the moment of their disappearance in a loop that continued serving a dinner no one would ever eat. The candles on the table were still burning, but had not melted. The ice in the water glasses had not begun to pool, and the radio in the kitchen was playing a song that had been retired from that station's rotation 4 years earlier. Raven Creek was the kind of town that appeared on maps only as a dot too small to merit a name, a collection of 47 souls spread across farmland that had been worked by the same families for generations. The Whitmores had lived on their property since before the town existed, their lineage traced back to settlers who arrived when this region was still disputed territory between nations that no longer existed. They kept to themselves more than most, attending church only on holidays and declining invitations to community events with polite excuses that everyone accepted without question. They were good neighbors in the rural sense, maintaining their fences and helping when asked, but otherwise respecting the unspoken boundaries that farming communities understood. The welfare check had been requested by Eleanor Marsh, whose property bordered the Whitmore land on the eastern edge. She told the dispatcher that she had not seen smoke from their chimney in almost a week, which was unusual given the December cold that had settled over the region. She mentioned that their dogs had stopped barking 3 days ago, animals that normally announced every passing car and wandering deer with enthusiasm that could be heard half a mile away, and she admitted with some embarrassment that she had driven past their house twice and felt something so wrong that she could not bring herself to turn into their driveway, a wrongness she could not articulate but could not ignore. Deputy Holloway had dismissed Eleanor's concerns as the overactive imagination of an elderly woman living alone too long. She had taken the call herself because she was the only officer on duty that evening, and because Raven Creek rarely produced anything more serious than occasional disputes over property lines or teenagers drinking in abandoned barns. She expected to find the Whitmores dealing with some family emergency, perhaps a relative's illness that had called them away suddenly, their departure hasty enough that they forgot to inform the neighbors. What she found instead was a scene that the state investigators would later describe as unprecedented in their collective experience. The front door was unlocked but not open, responding to her knock with silence before she turned the handle and stepped inside. The warmth that greeted her was the first wrong note, a comfortable heat that suggested the furnace had been running continuously, despite the house appearing dark from outside. She called out the standard announcement of her presence and received no response, her voice seeming to die in the air before it could reach the walls, absorbed by something that did not want sound to travel freely. Her flashlight cut through darkness that felt thicker than absence of light should feel, a darkness with texture and weight that pressed against her face like damp cloth. The dining room revealed itself as she moved deeper into the house, and what she saw there stopped her so completely that she would later estimate she stood motionless for 5 full minutes before her training reasserted itself. The table was set for 5, with plates arranged properly and serving dishes positioned in the center holding food that appeared to have been placed moments earlier. Roast chicken glistened with juices, still bubbling slightly from residual heat. Green beans steamed gently in their ceramic bowl. The bread in its basket was warm to the touch when Sarah finally found the courage to confirm what her eyes refused to believe. 5 chairs surrounded the table, and each one showed indentations in the cushions suggesting recent occupation. The napkins had been unfolded and placed in laps that were no longer there. The utensils showed signs of use, with food particles clinging to fork tines and knife blades, as if the family had been interrupted mid-bite. Martin Whitmore's reading glasses sat beside his plate, still bearing the warmth of his face. Linda's wedding ring lay next to her water glass, which she must have removed to apply lotion, as she did every evening, a detail Sarah would learn later from friends who knew the family's habits. And in the corner of the room, arranged in a neat row, sat 3 pairs of children's shoes, removed as required before sitting at the family table. Sarah called for backup on a radio that produced only static, the equipment failing in ways that would be documented as unexplainable by the department's technical staff. Her cell phone showed full signal strength, but would not connect to any number she dialed, the calls disappearing into silence that felt less like technical failure and more like deliberate interception. She was alone in this house with its impossible dinner and its absent family, and every instinct she possessed was screaming at her to leave immediately, to return with daylight and reinforcements and the courage that comes from numbers. But she was a deputy sworn to protect this community, and somewhere in this building a family might need her help. The kitchen offered no additional answers, only more questions that Sarah's mind refused to process fully. The oven was still on, maintaining a temperature that should have dried out or burned anything left inside for 6 days. The sink held dishes from breakfast, eggs, and bacon residue that had not dried or developed the smell of decay. A grocery list on the refrigerator included items that Linda had apparently intended to purchase on a shopping trip scheduled for the day after the family vanished. And on the counter, open to a recipe for the roast chicken, now cooling, on the dining table, sat a cookbook that had not been published until 3 years after the date the Whitmores were last seen by their neighbors. Sarah noticed the cookbook detail without understanding its implications, her conscious mind rejecting information that would have required accepting possibilities she was not prepared to consider. She photographed the scene with her department camera, the flash illuminating details that the darkness had hidden, casting shadows that moved in ways that shadows should not move when their light source was stationary. One photograph would later show something in the dining room doorway that Sarah had not seen when she took the picture, a shape that experts would argue about for years, some insisting it was a photographic artifact, while others maintained it showed a figure too thin and too tall to be human. The stairs to the 2nd floor seemed longer than architecture should allow, each step requiring effort that exceeded normal exertion, as if the house itself was resisting her ascent. The temperature dropped as she climbed, the comfortable warmth of the ground floor giving way to cold that bit at exposed skin and turned her breath to visible clouds. The family photographs lining the stairwell showed the Whitmores through generations, faces that repeated across decades with variations that tracked inherited features, and Sarah noticed with growing unease that the oldest photographs showed the same children who had left their shoes beside the dining table, wearing clothing appropriate to eras that predated their births by a century or more. The master bedroom was empty but occupied, a contradiction that Sarah felt more than observed. The bed was made with precision that suggested it had not been slept in recently, but the pillows held impressions of heads that must have rested there moments before. Martin's work boots stood beside the closet door, laced and ready for morning chores that would never be performed. Linda's nightgown hung from a hook on the bathroom door, still carrying traces of her perfume, a scent that should have faded within hours of her departure. The mirror above the dresser reflected Sarah's flashlight beam, but not Sarah herself, showing only the room behind her as if she had become invisible to glass. The children's rooms waited at the end of the hallway, 3 doors standing open to darkness that Sarah's flashlight could not fully penetrate. She entered the first room and found toys arranged in patterns that suggested recent play, dolls seated around a miniature table set for a tea party that paralleled the dinner scene downstairs. The second room contained books open on the bed, stories interrupted mid-page, and drawings tacked to the walls that showed the farmhouse surrounded by figures that did not resemble anything in nature, tall shapes with too many limbs reaching toward windows that the young artist had drawn with remarkable accuracy. The third room was empty except for a crib and a mobile that turned slowly, despite the absence of any air current to move it. Sarah descended the stairs at a pace that approached running, her professional composure finally cracking under the weight of accumulated wrongness. She reached the front door and found it locked, the deadbolt engaged despite her certainty that she had left it unsecured upon entry. The windows would not open. The back door was sealed with rust that suggested decades of disuse rather than days. She was trapped in a house that had rearranged itself around her, and the darkness outside the windows had grown complete. No moon or stars visible through glass that seemed to have thickened during her time inside. The sounds began softly, ambiguous enough that she could initially dismiss them as settling wood or wind against old walls. But they grew more defined as the minutes passed, resolving into footsteps that moved through the rooms above her, footsteps too light to belong to adults, accompanied by whispered conversation and voices that belonged to children who had been missing for 6 days. She heard chairs scraping against the dining room floor and turned to find the table reset, the food replenished, the candles burning at heights that suggested they had just been lit. The meal was beginning again, as it had begun every evening since the family's disappearance, as it would continue beginning until someone finally understood what the house was trying to communicate. State investigators found Deputy Holloway sitting at the dining table the following morning, having arrived when her failure to respond to radio checks finally prompted a search party. She was eating methodically from a plate of food that should have spoiled days earlier, her eyes focused on something none of them could see, her mouth moving in response to conversation they could not hear. The food on her plate was cold, the candles had burned to nubs, and the chair at the head of the table held an indentation suggesting recent occupation by someone of Martin Whitmore's size and weight. Sarah did not respond to her name, did not acknowledge the hands that pulled her away from the table, did not return to full awareness until 3 days later in a hospital bed 50 miles from Raven Creek. Her account of those missing hours changed every time she told it. Not because she was lying, but because the memories themselves seemed unstable, shifting like images viewed through water that would not stop rippling. She remembered the family returning to the table, sitting down as if they had merely stepped away for a moment rather than vanished for a week. She remembered Martin saying grace while the children squirmed impatiently, and Linda smiled at their antics. She remembered eating with them, tasting food that was simultaneously fresh and ancient, carrying flavors that did not belong to any ingredient she could identify. And she remembered what Martin told her when she finally asked where they had been. The Whitmores had not gone anywhere, Martin explained in her fractured memories. They had always been there, in the house their ancestors built on land that had been waiting for them since before the first settlers arrived. Time moved differently in Raven Creek, he said, flowing in currents that occasionally deposited the present into the past, or the future into the now. The family ate dinner every evening at the same moment they had eaten their last dinner, the event recurring endlessly because something beneath the land had enjoyed that particular moment and refused to let it conclude. They were not trapped, he insisted. They were preserved, maintained in a state of perpetual togetherness that most families could only dream of achieving. The state investigation officially concluded that the Whitmore family had left voluntarily, despite the physical impossibility of such a departure and the complete absence of any evidence supporting that theory. The house was sealed and the property transferred to county ownership, its deed tangled in complications that prevented sale or development. But locals reported lights in the windows on certain evenings, the warm glow of candles visible through glass that should have been too dusty to transmit light. They reported seeing figures seated around the dining table, a family of 5 enjoying a meal together, their movements slowed as if viewed through a medium thicker than air. Deputy Holloway resigned from the department 3 months after her recovery, citing personal reasons that she declined to elaborate upon. She moved to a city apartment 500 miles from Raven Creek and took a job that kept her indoors during evening hours. But she could not escape the dreams that came every night, dreams of sitting at a table set for 6, joining a family that had made room for her in their eternal dinner, eating food that tasted like home and never feeling full, no matter how much she consumed. She sometimes woke with the taste of mashed potatoes on her tongue and the smell of roast chicken in her nostrils, phantom sensations that lingered for hours after her eyes opened. The Whitmore farmhouse still stands on its hill overlooking Raven Creek, its windows dark most nights, but occasionally bright with light that neighbors have learned not to investigate. The road that passes the property has developed a reputation among travelers who report that their cars sometimes stall near the driveway, their engines dying without warning and refusing to restart until they push the vehicles past the property line. Some drivers claim to see a woman standing in the doorway, waving them in with a gesture that suggests dinner is ready and seats are waiting. Those who have accepted the invitation have not been seen again, their vehicles found abandoned the following morning, their belongings still inside, their families left to wonder. The current sheriff of Raven Creek enforces an unofficial policy of avoiding the Whitmore property entirely, citing jurisdictional ambiguities that do not actually exist. He inherited this policy from his predecessor, who inherited it from the predecessor before him, a chain of unspoken understanding stretching back to the night Deputy Holloway sat down at a table that exists outside of time. He knows the stories, and he knows better than to dismiss them, having grown up in this community with its strange currents and its older-than-human memories. He tells newcomers that some places are best left alone, that curiosity is a luxury that small towns cannot always afford, that dinner invitations from empty houses should always be declined. Every December, on the anniversary of the disappearance, Residents of Raven Creek report smelling roast chicken in the evening air, the scent drifting down from the hill on breezes that carry no other trace of the season's cold. They close their windows and lock their doors and eat their own dinners quickly, unwilling to extend meal times that might attract the attention of whatever waits in the farmhouse above. They teach their children the same caution, passing down warnings that have become as much a part of local tradition as any holiday celebration. And they never, ever drive past the Whitmore property after dark, when the lights come on and the table is set, and the family that has been eating dinner for decades waits patiently for new guests to join their endless meal. The mashed potatoes are still warm. The candles are still burning. And somewhere in that house, chairs scrape against old floorboards as the Whitmores take their seats one more time, their smiles fixed and welcoming, their hunger for company never quite satisfied despite the decades of waiting. Dinner is served in Raven Creek, and it has been served every evening since that December night. And it will continue being served until the last person who remembers the family finally forgets their names. Perhaps even then, the meal will continue, the ritual too deeply embedded in the fabric of that place to ever truly end. The table has room for more. There is always room for more.